Now that your husband is dead, grieve, pack your bags, and never come back," my daughter-in-law said at dinner. My son just smiled and nodded. The house was never really yours anyway. I moved out without a word. The next day, I went to the bank, and I'm glad I did. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. The dining room felt different without William's presence. The mahogany table that had hosted countless family dinners now seemed too large, too empty, despite the three of us sitting around it. Eleanor kept glancing at his empty chair, expecting to see him there with his gentle smile and calming presence. It had been exactly 1 week since they buried her husband of 32 years. 1 week since she'd stood at his graveside, feeling like half of her soul had been ripped away. The grief still sat heavy in her chest, making every breath feel labored. "Pass the potatoes," Stephanie said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Eleanor's daughter-in-law had never used a warm tone with her, but tonight there was something different, something colder. Eleanor reached for the serving bowl, her hands still trembling slightly. The funeral had drained her more than she'd expected. At 71, she thought she'd prepared herself for this day. But nothing could have prepared her for the hollow ache that followed her everywhere now. Michael, her 43-year-old son, sat between them like a referee who'd already chosen sides. He'd barely looked at her all evening, his attention focused entirely on his wife of 15 years. The son who used to crawl into her lap when he had nightmares couldn't even meet his eyes. "This service was beautiful, wasn't it?" Eleanor offered, trying to fill the uncomfortable silence. "Your father would have loved seeing so many people there." Stephanie set down her fork with deliberate precision. "Yes, well, that's actually what we need to discuss with you, Eleanor." Something in her tone made Eleanor's stomach clench. She looked between Stephanie and Michael, searching for any sign of the warmth that should exist between family members who just shared a loss. Instead, she found cold calculation in Stephanie's eyes and uncomfortable avoidance in her son. "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked, though part of her already dreaded the answer. Stephanie straightened in her chair, assuming the posture she used when delivering ultimatums. Eleanor had seen it before, usually when she was explaining why Michael couldn't visit her as often or why family traditions needed to be changed to accommodate her preferences. "Michael and I have been talking," Stephanie began, her voice taking on that false sweetness she used when she wanted something. "Now that William is gone, this house is going to be too much for you to handle alone." Eleanor blinked, confused. "Too much? I've been managing this house for over 30 years. I know every creaky floorboard and temperamental faucet." "Yes, that's exactly the problem," Stephanie continued, her mask of pleasantness slipping slightly. "You're not getting any younger, and maintaining a house this size is expensive. Michael and I think it would be best if you moved somewhere more suitable." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. "Moved? This is my home. William and I built our life here. Michael grew up here." Michael finally spoke, his voice barely above a mumble. "Mom, Stephanie's right. The upkeep alone is going to be overwhelming for you." "I'm not helpless, Michael," Eleanor said, hearing her voice crack slightly. "And this house, your father and I saved for years to buy this place. Every room holds memories of our life together." Stephanie's expression hardened. "Memories don't pay utility bills or property taxes. Be practical, Eleanor." Eleanor stared at her, this woman who'd systematically pushed her out of her son's life for 15 years. The woman who'd convinced Michael that Sunday dinners with her mother were too much pressure, and that holiday visits needed to be balanced between families, which somehow always meant more time with her relatives. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Eleanor asked, though she could feel the answer forming like ice in her stomach. "We think you should look into one of those nice senior communities," Stephanie said, her tone suggesting she was doing Eleanor a tremendous favor. "Somewhere with activities and people your own age. It would be so much better for you than rattling around in this big empty house." Eleanor turned to Michael, desperately hoping to see some sign that he disagreed with this plan. "Michael, you really think I should sell the house where you grew up, where your father and I—" "It makes sense, Mom," he interrupted, still not meeting her eyes. And honestly, Stephanie and I could use the space. We've been talking about expanding our family, and this house has so much potential. The meaning behind his words crashed over Eleanor like a cold wave. They didn't just want her gone, they wanted her house. The home William and she had lovingly restored room by room over 3 decades. Now Stephanie was looking at it like a prize to be claimed. Now that William's dead, live your grief, pack your bags, and never come back. Stephanie's voice suddenly lost all pretense of civility. The cruel words rolled off her tongue with casual cruelty, as if she was discussing disposing of old furniture instead of throwing out her husband's mother. The house was never really yours anyway. Eleanor felt her world tilt on its axis. Just living here? As if 32 years of marriage, of building a life and raising a family, amounted to nothing more than extended house sitting. Michael looked up then, and for a moment Eleanor saw something flicker in his eyes. Uncertainty, maybe even guilt. But then he smiled and nodded. "She's right, Mom. This house was Dad's, and now it's mine. You were just living here." Eleanor stood up slowly, her legs unsteady. Every eye was on her, the air thick with expectation. Inside, something was breaking apart. Not just her heart, but her understanding of who her son was, who her family was. "I see," she said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'll need some time to—" "2 weeks," Stephanie cut her off. "That should be plenty of time to find somewhere suitable and arrange for movers." 2 weeks? Not 2 months. Not even a reasonable timeline to grieve and plan. 2 weeks to dismantle a lifetime? Michael finally looked directly at her, and what Eleanor saw there was worse than anger or hatred. It was indifference. Complete, casual indifference to her pain. "It's for the best, Mom. You'll see." Eleanor walked upstairs to the bedroom she'd shared with William, each step feeling like she was climbing a mountain. The room still smelled like his cologne, and his reading glasses were still on the nightstand where he'd left them the night before his heart attack. She sat on the edge of their bed and stared at her reflection in the dresser mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed older than 71, her silver hair limp and her blue eyes dulled by shock and grief. In 2 weeks, she would have to leave this room where she'd said goodbye to William just 7 days ago. She would have to pack up 32 years of marriage into boxes and surrender it all to a son who just told her she'd never really belonged here anyway. But as she sat there in the gathering darkness, something else began to stir beneath the grief and shock. A small, hard kernel of determination. William had always been the one who handled their finances, but he'd taught her to be thorough, to pay attention to details. Tomorrow, she would start making arrangements. She would call the bank and begin the process of figuring out exactly what she was entitled to. Because if Michael and Stephanie thought they could just erase her from this family without consequence, they might be in for a surprise. The first thing she needed to do was understand exactly what William had left behind and to whom. The morning sun felt different streaming through the kitchen windows as Eleanor sat alone at the breakfast table, nursing her second cup of coffee. 10 days had passed since that awful dinner, and the house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for her to leave. Michael and Stephanie had already been by twice to assess the space, measuring rooms and discussing renovations as if Eleanor were invisible. Yesterday, she'd overheard Stephanie on the phone with a contractor, scheduling estimates for once the old woman moves out. Eleanor had spent those 10 days in a strange bubble of numbness, mechanically sorting through belongings and trying to ignore the growing knot of anxiety in her stomach. But this morning, she finally felt ready to face the practical matters William would have expected her to handle. The drive to First National Bank took 15 minutes through the familiar streets of their neighborhood. Eleanor had been making this same drive for over 20 years, usually with William in the passenger seat, handling their banking business while she waited in the car. He'd always been protective of their finances, not because he didn't trust her, but because he said it was one less thing for her to worry about. Now she wished she'd paid more attention. Mrs. Patterson, the bank manager, greeted Eleanor with the careful sympathy reserved for recent widows. "Mrs. Henderson, I was so sorry to hear about William. He was such a gentleman, always asking about my grandchildren." "Thank you, Helen. He spoke fondly of you, too." Eleanor settled into the chair across from her desk, her purse clutched tightly in her lap. "I need to understand my financial situation. William handled everything, and I'm afraid I'm rather lost." Helen's expression softened with understanding. "Of course, let me pull up your accounts." She turned to her computer, fingers clicking across the keyboard. After a moment, her eyebrows rose slightly. "Oh my," Helen said, her voice holding a note of surprise. "Is something wrong?" Eleanor's heart jumped. Had Michael and Stephanie somehow already gained access to their accounts? "Not wrong exactly, it's just that there are quite a few accounts here. More than I was expecting." Helen's voice held genuine surprise. "Let me start with the joint checking account you and William used for household expenses." She printed out a statement and slid it across the desk. The balance was modest but comfortable, enough to cover Eleanor's expenses for several months if she was careful. Relief flooded through her. At least she wouldn't be destitute. "Now," Helen continued, "there's also a savings account in both your names." Another sheet of paper appeared. This balance was significantly larger, enough to sustain Eleanor for years if necessary. "That's wonderful," Eleanor said, feeling some of the tension leave her shoulders. William was always careful about saving. "Yes, he was very methodical," Helen agreed, but she was still frowning at her screen. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm seeing several other accounts here that I need to verify. Some appeared to be in your name only." Eleanor's confusion deepened. "My name only? That doesn't sound right. William handled all our finances." Helen's fingers flew over the keyboard again. "According to our records, there are 4 additional accounts, 2 CDs, a money market account, and, this is interesting, a trust account that was established 5 years ago." Eleanor's head began to spin. "I don't understand. William never mentioned any of this to me." "May I ask," Helen said carefully, "did your husband ever express concerns about your family situation? Sometimes clients establish separate accounts as a form of protection." The question caught Eleanor off guard. "Protection from what? I'm not sure what you mean." Helen hesitated, clearly choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes when clients have complex family dynamics, perhaps concerns about inheritance disputes or external pressures, they take steps to ensure their spouse's financial security." Eleanor thought about William's behavior over the past few years, how he'd started asking pointed questions about Stephanie's spending habits, how he'd grown quiet whenever Michael mentioned their financial struggles, how he'd insisted on handling all their banking personally, never allowing Michael to accompany him even when their son offered to. "Can you tell me about these other accounts?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Helen printed several more pages. "The first CD has been rolling over annually for 7 years. The second was opened 3 years ago. The money market account has been receiving automatic transfers from your joint checking account. Small amounts, $50 here and there, but over time," she handed Eleanor the statements. The numbers swam in front of her eyes. These weren't modest emergency funds. These were substantial amounts of money. Enough to buy a house, enough to live comfortably for decades. "How is this possible?" Eleanor asked. "I never signed anything. I never—" "Actually, you did," Helen said gently, pulling out a file folder. "Your signatures are on all the paperwork. It appears William brought you in to sign documents, probably telling you they were routine banking updates or insurance forms." Eleanor stared at the papers Helen showed her. There was her signature, dated and witnessed, on forms she didn't remember signing. But looking at the dates, she could place some of them. The day they'd come in to update their address after the house numbers changed, the time they'd switch to a new type of checking account. He never told me what I was really signing. She whispered. It's not uncommon, Helen said carefully. Some spouses prefer to handle the details to avoid causing stress or confusion. And legally, everything is above board. These accounts are legitimately yours. Eleanor tried to process what this meant. While Michael and Stephanie were measuring her kitchen and planning their renovations, while they were treating her like a burden to be disposed of, she had resources they knew nothing about. There's one more thing, Helen said, her voice even more cautious now. The trust account I mentioned, it's been receiving transfers from a business account for the past 5 years, the Henderson Construction Trust. I believe that was your husband's company. Yes, but William sold the business when he retired. Michael said the money from the sale was barely enough to pay off debts. Helen consulted her screen again. According to our records, the business account is still active. There have been regular deposits and then transfers to your trust account. Mrs. Henderson, I think you need to speak with the business accountant. There may be more to your financial picture than you realize. Eleanor left the bank in a daze, her purse heavy with account statements and printouts. Instead of driving straight home, she pulled into the parking lot of a small cafe and sat in her car, reading through everything Helen had given her. The numbers didn't lie. Somehow, without her knowledge, William had been systematically protecting her. Every account, every investment, every trust fund was structured to ensure she would be financially independent. As she studied the trust account statements, a pattern emerged. The deposits corresponded with Michael's visits over the past 5 years, always larger amounts after Michael had asked his father for small loans or when Stephanie had hinted about their financial struggles. William had been giving their son money, but he'd been protecting an equal or greater amount for Eleanor, as if he'd known that someday she might need to stand on her own. Her phone buzzed with a text from Michael. Mom, Stephanie found a realtor to list the house. We can start showing it next week. Hope you're making progress on finding a place. Eleanor stared at the message for a long moment, then looked again at the bank statements in her lap. Michael and Stephanie were so confident, so certain they held all the cards. They had no idea that their careful plans were built on a foundation they didn't understand. Tomorrow, she would call the business accountant. She would find out exactly what else William had left behind, and then she would decide what to do with the knowledge that her husband had loved her enough to ensure she'd never be at anyone's mercy. The grief was still there, as fresh and sharp as ever, but underneath it, something else was growing, a quiet strength she hadn't felt in years. William had given her more than money. He'd given her freedom. The accounting office of Morrison & Associates sat in a modest strip mall between a dry cleaner and a tax preparation service. Eleanor had never been here before. William had always handled the business meetings himself, claiming it was boring paperwork that would only give her a headache. Now she understood he'd been protecting her from more than just tedium. Margaret Morrison looked to be about Eleanor's age, with steel gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She'd been handling Henderson Construction's books for over 15 years, and her expression when Eleanor had called yesterday had been carefully neutral. Mrs. Henderson, first, let me offer your condolences. William was a good man and an honest businessman. I'm going to miss our quarterly meetings. Thank you. I wish I could say I knew him as well in business as you did. I'm trying to understand our financial situation, and the bank mentioned ongoing business income that I wasn't aware of. You weren't aware? That's unusual. William spoke about you often, and I assumed... She trailed off, seeming to reconsider her words. Please, I need to understand what's been happening. My son tells me the business was sold years ago and barely covered its debts. Sold? Margaret looked genuinely confused. Mrs. Henderson, Henderson Construction wasn't sold, it was restructured. She turned to her computer, pulling up files. 5 years ago, William transferred ownership of the company assets into a trust, the Henderson Construction Trust. You're listed as the primary beneficiary. The room seemed to tilt slightly. I'm the owner of the construction company? Well, the trust owns it and you own the trust. It's been quite successful, actually. Your husband was very careful about the contracts he accepted after the restructuring. Smaller jobs, reliable clients, steady income rather than the boom and bust cycle of larger commercial projects. She printed out several pages and handed them to Eleanor. These are the profit and loss statements for the past 5 years. As you can see, the company has been generating consistent revenue. Eleanor stared at the numbers, her hands trembling slightly. The annual profits were substantial, more than enough to explain the regular deposits she'd seen in the trust account statements. But William retired. He wasn't working anymore. He stepped back from the day-to-day operations, yes, but he maintained oversight and handled the larger strategic decisions. The actual construction work has been managed by Tom Bradley. I believe you know him. Eleanor nodded. Tom had worked for William for over 20 years, starting as a young apprentice and working his way up to foreman. He'd been at the funeral, one of the few people there who seemed genuinely grief-stricken. Tom has been essentially running the company for the past 5 years, Margaret continued. William structured it so that Tom receives a percentage of the profits as a performance bonus, which has kept him motivated and loyal. It's been a very successful arrangement. Why didn't William tell me any of this? The question came out as barely a whisper. Margaret hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Mrs. Henderson, this might not be my place to say, but William was concerned about family pressures. He mentioned that your son had been struggling financially and that his wife had expensive tastes. William worried that if the family knew about the continued business income, there would be expectations and demands that might compromise your future security. The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity. Every time Michael had asked his father for a loan, every time Stephanie had made comments about how comfortable they seemed, William had been calculating how to help their son without sacrificing Eleanor's future independence.
He was protecting me, Eleanor said, the words heavy with realization. He was protecting both of you, in different ways, Margaret said gently. The loans he made to Michael over the years were substantial, but they came from the business operating account, not from your personal assets, and he was very careful to document everything properly. She pulled out another file folder. These are copies of all the loan agreements between the business and your son. William insisted on treating them as formal business transactions, with payment schedules and interest rates. Eleanor opened the folder with shaking hands, page after page of loan documents, each one signed by both William and Michael. The amounts were staggering, tens of thousands of dollars over the past 5 years, supposedly for Michael's various business ventures and investments. Has Michael been making payments on these loans? Eleanor asked, though she already suspected the answer. Margaret's expression grew uncomfortable. The payment schedule shows significant arrears. As of last month, the outstanding balance, with accumulated interest, is approximately $87,000. The number hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Michael owed the family business, her business, nearly $90,000 while simultaneously claiming his father had left nothing but debts. What happens to these loan obligations now? Eleanor asked. They transfer with the business assets. As the new owner of the trust, you have the legal right to demand payment or restructure the terms as you see fit. Eleanor thought about Michael and Stephanie measuring her kitchen, planning their renovations, discussing when they could start showing the house. They were so confident, so certain they deserved everything William had built. There's one more thing you should know, Margaret said, her voice even more careful now. Last month, your son contacted me directly. He said that with his father's passing, he'd be taking over management of the business affairs. He asked me to prepare transfer of ownership documents. Eleanor's blood ran cold. And what did you tell him? I told him I'd need written authorization from the trust beneficiary, from you. He seemed surprised that you were involved in the business structure at all. So,
Michael had been planning to claim the business along with the house, assuming Eleanor was too grief-stricken and naive to understand what was happening. The betrayal cut deeper than she'd thought possible. "Margaret, I need to ask you something confidential," Eleanor said. "If I wanted to maintain the current business structure with Tom continuing to manage operations, would that be feasible?" "Absolutely. Tom has been hoping to hear from you, actually. He's concerned about the company's future and his own job security. If you're willing to maintain the status quo, I think you'd find him very reliable and grateful for the opportunity to continue." Eleanor gathered up all the papers, her mind reeling with the implications of what she'd learned. The business was hers, the substantial debt Michael had accumulated was real and legally enforceable, and neither he nor Stephanie had any idea that their plans were built on a foundation of lies and assumptions. "I'd like to schedule a meeting with Tom as soon as possible, and I want to understand all of my options regarding the outstanding loans." "Of course. Shall I call Tom this afternoon?" "Yes, please. And Margaret, I'd appreciate it if this conversation remained confidential for now." "Absolutely. Client confidentiality is sacred in this business." As Eleanor drove home, her phone buzzed with another text from Stephanie. "Eleanor, the realtor wants to schedule a photographer for tomorrow. Make sure the house is clean and decluttered. First impressions matter for potential buyers." Eleanor stared at the message for a long moment before tucking her phone away without responding. Let them plan their photography session. Let them imagine their future in her house, spending money they thought they'd inherited. They had no idea that the foundation they were building their dreams on was about to crumble beneath them. That evening, Eleanor sat in William's study for the first time since his death, surrounded by his carefully organized files. Now she understood why he'd been so meticulous about record keeping, why he'd insisted on proper documentation for every transaction. He'd been building a fortress around her, brick by brick, transaction by transaction. And tomorrow, she would start to learn how strong those walls really were. Tom Bradley's weathered hands wrapped around his coffee mug as they sat in Eleanor's kitchen the next morning. At 55, he still had the broad shoulders and calloused palms of a man who'd spent his life building things, but his eyes held a weariness Eleanor had never seen before. "Mrs. Henderson, I've got to be honest with you. I've been worried sick since Mr. William passed. Michael came by the job site last week talking about evaluating assets and streamlining operations. It didn't sound good for folks like me." Eleanor poured herself another cup of coffee, using the familiar routine to steady her nerves. "Tom, what exactly did my son tell you?" "He said the family was going through some financial difficulties, that tough decisions would need to be made about the business. He wanted me to give him a complete list of all our current contracts, equipment, and cash flow projections." Tom's jaw tightened. He also asked about the keys to the equipment yard and the office. "And what did you tell him?" "That I'd need to talk to whoever was actually in charge now. Mr. William always told me that if anything happened to him, I should wait for proper instruction from the legal owner." Tom met Eleanor's eyes. "He never said it would be Michael." Relief flooded through Eleanor. William had prepared for this scenario, ensuring that Tom would be a guardian of the business rather than simply handing it over to anyone who claimed authority. "Tom, I need to share something with you, but I need your word that this conversation stays between us for now." His expression grew serious. "You have it, ma'am." Eleanor spread out the documents Margaret had given her the day before. "I own Henderson Construction, not Michael, not the estate. Me. William transferred everything into a trust 5 years ago, and I'm the beneficiary." Tom's eyes widened as he studied the papers. "Well, I'll be damned. Pardon my language, ma'am, but Mr. William was always thinking 3 steps ahead." He was indeed, and according to these records, the business has been quite profitable under your management. A flush of pride crossed his features. "We've built a good reputation, Mrs. Henderson. Steady clients, quality work, fair prices. Mr. William taught me that repeat customers are worth more than any single score." I want you to continue exactly as you have been, but I need to understand something. Michael has been less than honest about the family's financial situation. Can you tell me about any interactions you've had with him regarding business matters?" His expression darkened. There have been several over the years. He'd come around when Mr. William wasn't there, asking about cash flow, wanting to know about upcoming payments from clients. A couple times, he suggested that maybe the business could help him out with some temporary funding for investment opportunities. And what did you tell him? That he'd need to talk to his father. "I'm not stupid, ma'am. I could see what was happening." Tom's voice grew harder. "Last year, he actually showed up at the bank the same day we deposited a big payment from the Morrison office building project. Just coincidence," he said, but he was mighty interested in talking to the teller about the deposit. Eleanor's stomach clenched. Michael had been monitoring the business income, probably trying to time his requests for loans to coincide with maximum available cash. "Tom, I want to ask you something, and I need complete honesty. Do you think Michael understands how much money has been flowing through this business?" He was quiet for a long moment, considering. "I think he knows it's more than your family let on, but I don't think he knows the full extent. Mr. William was very careful about keeping business and personal finances separate, at least on paper."
"What do you mean?" Eleanor asked. "Well, your husband was smart about it. When Michael would ask for help, Mr. William would tell him the business was struggling, that margins were tight, but then he'd find a way to help anyway, usually as a loan from the business account rather than from his personal funds." Tom pulled out his own small notebook, worn from years of use. "I keep track of everything, Mrs. Henderson. It's a habit Mr. William taught me. According to my records, Michael has received payments totaling about $93,000 over the past 5 years. The number was even higher than what Margaret had shown her. Payments, not loans? That's what I mean about Mr. William being smart. He'd structure them as loans on paper, with payment schedules and everything. But he never actually enforced the payment terms. Michael would miss a payment, and Mr. William would just let it slide. So Michael thinks he owes nothing?" "Michael acts like he owes nothing," Tom corrected. "Whether he really believes it or just pretends to believe it, I can't say." As if summoned by their conversation, Eleanor heard a car door slam in the driveway. Through the kitchen window, she could see Michael's Honda Pilot parked behind Tom's work truck. "That's my son," Eleanor said quietly. "I don't want him to know we've been talking about business matters." Tom nodded and quickly gathered up the papers Eleanor had shown him. "Mrs. Henderson, whatever you decide to do, you have my full support. Mr. William was a good man, and he trusted you enough to put everything in your name. That's good enough for me." Michael walked in without knocking, something that would have irritated William, but which Eleanor had learned to accept over the years. "Morning, Mom," he said, barely glancing at Tom. "I wasn't expecting company." "Tom stopped by to check on me," Eleanor said smoothly. "You know how thoughtful he's always been." "Right." Michael's attention was already elsewhere, his eyes scanning the kitchen as if evaluating it for resale. "Actually, Tom, I'm glad you're here. We need to talk about the business situation." Tom's expression became carefully neutral. "Oh. With Dad gone, there are going to be some changes. The family needs to make some practical decisions about assets and ongoing obligations." Eleanor watched this exchange with fascination. Michael was so confident, so certain of his authority. He had no idea he was trying to claim something that never belonged to him. "What kind of changes?" "Well, we'll need to evaluate whether it makes sense to continue operations or if it would be better to liquidate assets and settle any outstanding debts." Michael's tone was casual, as if he were discussing what to have for lunch. "I see. And who's making these decisions?" Michael blinked, clearly not expecting the question. "The family, of course. I'll be handling Dad's business affairs going forward." "Will you, now?" Tom's voice was carefully neutral, but Eleanor caught the slight emphasis on "you." "Mom, you might want to make some fresh coffee," Michael said, dismissing Eleanor as he always had when important conversations were taking place.
Tom and I need to discuss some technical details." But Eleanor didn't move. For the first time in years, she stood her ground. "I'll stay, thank you. This is my kitchen, and Tom is my guest." Michael looked surprised but shrugged. "Fine. Tom, I'll need you to prepare a complete inventory of all equipment, vehicles, and current contracts. I'll also need access to the business accounts so I can assess the financial situation. I'd be happy to help with that. Who should I coordinate with regarding authorization for account access?" "With me, obviously. And you have the legal authority to access Henderson Construction accounts because I'm William Henderson's son and heir." Michael said it in a condescending tone that he used when he felt challenged. "Look, Tom, I don't think you understand the situation here. This isn't a hostile takeover. I'm trying to clean up Dad's affairs and make sure everyone gets taken care of. But I can't do that if you're going to make things difficult." "I'm not trying to make things difficult. I'm just trying to understand who I'm supposed to be taking orders from. Your father was very clear about proper procedures and documentation." Michael turned to Eleanor, expecting support. "Mom, explain to Tom that I'm handling Dad's business matters now." Eleanor looked at her son, this man who was planning to sell her house out from under her, who had accumulated nearly $90,000 in debt while claiming his father left nothing behind, and made her choice. "Actually, Michael, I think Tom is right to ask for proper documentation. Your father was always very careful about these things." Michael stared at her as if she'd grown a second head. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about making sure everything is handled properly and legally. Surely you can understand the importance of that." For the first time since this conversation began, Michael looked uncertain, and watching that uncertainty creep across his features, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in years: power. The phone call came at 7 in the morning, 3 days after Eleanor's confrontation with Michael in the kitchen. She'd been expecting it. You can't question someone's assumed authority without consequences, especially when that someone is used to getting his way. "Mom, we need to talk. Now." Michael's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "Stephanie and I are coming over." "It's rather early, don't you think?" "This can't wait. We'll be there in 20 minutes." The line went dead before Eleanor could respond. She took her time getting dressed, choosing a navy blue dress that William had always said made her look dignified. If this was going to be a confrontation, she intended to face it properly. They arrived exactly 20 minutes later, Stephanie's heels clicking aggressively on the front porch. Eleanor opened the door before they could knock, maintaining the small advantage of being the hostess in her own home. "Good morning," she said pleasantly, as if this were a social visit. Stephanie pushed past her into the living room, her designer purse clutched like a weapon. Michael followed, his face grim. They both remained standing, positioning themselves between Eleanor and the door in what she recognized as an intimidation tactic. "Mom, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but Tom Bradley called yesterday and said he can't provide me with business information without proper authorization. What did you tell him?" Eleanor settled into William's favorite armchair, the one with the best view of the room. "I told him to follow proper procedures. Your father would have expected that." "Proper procedures?" Stephanie's voice was shrill. "Michael is William's son and heir. What more authorization does anyone need?" "Legal authorization," Eleanor said calmly. "The kind that comes with actual ownership." Michael's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about? Dad's will leaves everything to the family. I'm the executor, which means I handle all the assets until probate is settled." "Actually, Michael, that's not quite accurate." Eleanor reached for the folder she'd placed on the side table, the one that contained all the documents Margaret Morrison had given her. Michael and Stephanie both tensed as she opened it. "Your father's will does indeed leave his personal possessions and this house to the family. But Henderson Construction isn't part of his estate. It hasn't been for 5 years." "What are you talking about?" Michael demanded. Eleanor pulled out the trust documents and set them on the coffee table between them. "Henderson Construction has been owned by the Henderson Construction Trust since 2019. I am the sole beneficiary of that trust." The silence that followed was deafening.
Stephanie reached for the documents first, her manicured fingers shaking as she scanned the legal language. Michael read over her shoulder, his face growing pale.
"This is impossible," Stephanie whispered. "You don't know anything about business. You never even balanced a checkbook." "You're right, I didn't. Your father handled all of that. But apparently, he understood things about our family situation that I was too naive to see." Michael sank onto the sofa as if his legs had given out. But the business was struggling. Dad always said margins were tight, that there was barely enough to keep operations running. "The business has been quite profitable, actually. Here are the financial statements for the past 5 years. Eleanor handed him another set of papers. Watching Michael's face as he processed the numbers was like watching someone realize they'd been playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. "These profits." Michael's voice was barely audible. "Where did this money go?" "Some of it went to you, Michael. Quite a lot of it, actually." Eleanor pulled out the loan documentation. $87,000 over 5 years, to be precise. Stephanie grabbed the loan papers, her eyes scanning frantically. "These say loans, Michael. You told me those were gifts. You said your father was helping us get established." "They were gifts," Michael said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Dad never asked for payments. He never even mentioned payment schedules." "Actually, he did. Margaret Morrison has copies of every conversation, every missed payment, every time your father chose to extend the terms rather than demand what you owed." Eleanor watched as the reality of their situation began to sink in. Michael had built his financial life on the assumption that his father's generosity would continue indefinitely. He'd probably borrowed against those expectations, made commitments based on money he thought was his. "But this doesn't change anything," Stephanie said suddenly, her voice taking on a desperate edge. "The house still goes to Michael. That's worth more than some little construction business." "Is it?" Eleanor asked mildly. Stephanie's eyes flashed with something between anger and panic. "Don't play games, Eleanor. This house is worth at least $400,000. "You're right. It's a lovely property. Of course, there is the matter of the mortgage." Michael looked up sharply. "What mortgage? Dad said the house was paid off." "It was, but 18 months ago, your father took out a home equity loan. Quite a substantial one, actually." Eleanor pulled out the final set of documents, the ones she'd discovered in William's study just yesterday, filed carefully in a folder marked Emergency Funds. A home equity loan for $350,000. The proceeds were transferred into the Henderson Construction Trust account, which means they became part of my inheritance. Stephanie's face went white. "That's not possible. We would have known. We would have had to sign." "Your father was the sole owner of the house at the time. I was listed as a spouse with rights of survivorship, but not as a co-owner. He didn't need anyone else's signature." Michael stared at the loan documents like they were written in a foreign language. But why would he do this? Why would he mortgage the house just to put money in a business account? For the first time since this conversation began, Eleanor allowed her carefully controlled emotions to show. "Because he was protecting me. He was making sure that no matter what happened, I would have financial security." "Protecting you from what?" Michael's voice was hoarse. "From this." Eleanor gestured to the scene in front of her. "From being thrown out of my own home by family members who saw me as a burden instead of a person. From being left with nothing while everyone else claimed what they thought they deserved." Stephanie's composure finally cracked completely. "You manipulated him. You convinced a dying man to change everything." "Your father wasn't dying when he set up these trusts, Stephanie. He was planning. And the fact that he felt the need to plan for this scenario should tell you something about how he viewed our family dynamics." Michael's hands were shaking as he set down the papers. "Mom, surely we can work something out. You don't really want to run a construction business. And the house, this house is our family home. It should stay in the family. It is staying in the family, Michael. It's staying with me. But the mortgage payments, Stephanie said desperately. How will you afford the mortgage payments? The same way your father intended, with income from Henderson Construction. Tom Bradley assures me the business is quite stable, and Margaret Morrison says the cash flow will easily cover the loan payments with plenty left over for my living expenses. Eleanor stood up, smoothing her dress. Now, I believe you mentioned something about moving out. I think that's still an excellent idea. Not for me, of course, but I'm sure you'll find somewhere lovely to start fresh. Michael looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. Mom, you can't be serious. After everything Dad did for you, everything our family means? Your father did do everything for me. He loved me enough to make sure I'd never be at anyone's mercy, including my own son's. And now I understand just how much I needed that protection. Stephanie was already at the door, her face twisted with rage and disbelief. This isn't over, Eleanor. We'll fight this. We'll contest everything. You're welcome to try, Eleanor said calmly, but you should know that everything your father did was completely legal and properly documented. Margaret Morrison is very thorough, and she's already provided copies of all relevant documents to my attorney.
Michael paused at the door, his expression a mixture of confusion and hurt. I don't understand. Mom, why are you doing this to us? I'm not doing anything to you, Michael. I'm simply refusing to let you do it to me. After they left, Eleanor sat alone in the sudden quiet of her house, and felt something she hadn't experienced in decades. For the first time since she was a young woman, she was completely financially independent. She owed nothing to anyone, and no one could take away what she had. William had given her more than money. He'd given her freedom. 6 months later, Eleanor stood on the deck of her new oceanfront cottage, watching the morning sun paint golden streaks across the Pacific. The sound of waves against the rocks below had become her daily symphony, replacing the familiar creaks and settling sounds of the old house. The cottage in Mendocino was smaller than the family home, but it was entirely hers. Every piece of furniture, every decorative choice, every room reflected her taste rather than compromises made over 32 years of marriage. She discovered, to her surprise, that she had excellent taste when nobody else was offering opinions. Henderson Construction continued to thrive under Tom Bradley's management. He called every Friday afternoon to update her on current projects and upcoming contracts, and quarterly profits were deposited directly into her account. She'd kept her promise to maintain the business exactly as William had structured it, and everyone involved seemed happier for the stability. The cottage in Mendocino was smaller than the family home, but it was entirely hers. Every piece of furniture, every decorative choice, every room reflected her taste, rather than compromises made over 32 years of marriage. She discovered, to her surprise, that she had excellent taste when nobody else was offering opinions. Henderson Construction continued to thrive under Tom Bradley's management. He called every Friday afternoon to update her on current projects and upcoming contracts, and quarterly profits were deposited directly into her account. She'd kept her promise to maintain the business exactly as William had structured it, and everyone involved seemed happier for the stability. The cottage had been an unexpected discovery. While researching properties in coastal California, Eleanor had learned that William had purchased it 3 years ago through the construction trust. Margaret Morrison had found the deed while organizing business assets, along with a note in William's handwriting. For Eleanor's retirement, when she's ready for ocean air and no schedule but her own. Even in death, her husband was still taking care of her. This morning was special, though. Her lawyer was coming by to finalize the last piece of business from her old wife. Michael and Stephanie had indeed tried to contest the trust arrangements, hiring an expensive attorney who specialized in elder law and financial exploitation cases. It hadn't gone well for them. The investigation had revealed that not only were all of William's financial arrangements completely legal and properly executed, but Michael's debt to the business was actually larger than anyone had initially calculated. Interest and penalties brought the total to just over $96,000. The doorbell rang at exactly 10 o'clock. James Patterson was a precise man who believed punctuality reflected character. He'd been representing Eleanor since this whole mess began, and his calm competence had been invaluable during the more stressful moments. "Good morning, Eleanor," he said, settling into the comfortable chair by the window that had become his usual spot during their meetings. "I have the final settlement agreement for your review." Eleanor poured coffee from the French press she'd learned to use, another small freedom in her new life, and sat across from him. "How did they take the final terms?" James's expression suggested controlled amusement. "About as well as you'd expect. Michael's attorney spent considerable time arguing that family obligations should supersede business contracts, but ultimately the law is quite clear on debt obligations." He handed her the settlement documents. After 6 months of legal wrangling, Michael and Stephanie had agreed to terms that acknowledged the full debt and established a payment plan that would take them 8 years to complete, assuming they never missed a payment. They tried once more to negotiate a family forgiveness clause. Michael actually broke down in the final meeting, claiming that you were destroying your relationship with your only son over money. "And what did you tell them?" "I reminded them that I was representing your financial interests, not your family relationships. Though I may have mentioned that most mothers don't have to sue their children to collect legitimate debts." The settlement also included a provision that particularly satisfied Eleanor. If Michael and Stephanie defaulted on payments, the business could legally garnish Michael's wages and place liens on any property they purchased. It was a safety net that would ensure she received what was owed, regardless of their future financial decisions. "There's one more thing," James said, pulling out a separate envelope. "This arrived for you yesterday." The envelope was addressed in Michael's familiar handwriting. Inside was a brief note on plain paper. "Mom, I know you probably won't forgive me for fighting you on this, but I wanted you to know that I finally understand what Dad was doing. It took losing almost everything for me to see how much I'd taken for granted. Stephanie and I are getting marriage counseling, and I'm working 2 jobs to meet the payment schedule. I'm hoping that someday you might be willing to talk to me again. I'm sorry for everything. Michael."
Eleanor folded the letter carefully and set it aside. The apology was genuine, she could tell, but it was also 6 months too late and motivated by consequences rather than conscience. "Any response you'd like me to convey?" James asked. "No. If Michael wants to rebuild a relationship with me, he can do it the same way he'll pay off his debt, gradually, consistently, and over time." After James left, Eleanor took her coffee out to the deck and read Michael's letter again. The grief was still there, not just for William, but for the son she'd thought she'd raised and the family relationships she'd believed were real. But underneath the sadness was something stronger, a deep satisfaction that she'd stood up for herself when it mattered most. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but something about it seemed familiar. "Hello, Mrs. Henderson. This is Linda Morrison, Margaret's daughter. I hope you don't mind me calling." Eleanor did remember Linda, a nurse who worked at the regional hospital. Margaret had mentioned her occasionally during their meetings. "Of course not, dear. How can I help you?" "Well, it's actually how you might help us. Mom told me about your situation, about how you had to rebuild your life after family difficulties. I'm starting a support group for women who've had to deal with financial manipulation by family members, and I wondered if you might be willing to share your experience."
The request caught Eleanor off guard. "I'm not sure I'd know what to say." You'd be surprised how many women find themselves in similar situations. Adult children who feel entitled to their parents' assets, spouses who hide financial information, family members who mistake kindness for weakness. Your story could help other women understand their rights and find the courage to protect themselves. Eleanor thought about this for a moment, watching a pelican dive for fish in the bay below. 6 months ago, she'd been a grieving widow facing homelessness at the hands of her own son. Today, she was financially independent, living exactly where she wanted to live, accountable to no one but herself. "When would you like me to speak?" Eleanor asked. "Really? You'll do it." "I think I will, but not about revenge or legal battles. I want to talk about the difference between being a loving family member and being a doormat, about the importance of understanding your own financial situation, about the gift William gave me when he protected my future, even from our own son." They scheduled the speaking engagement for the following month. After hanging up, Eleanor realized that helping other women navigate similar situations felt like a purpose, a way to honor both William's protection and her own hard-won independence. That evening, Eleanor did something she'd started doing every night since moving to the cottage. She sat on her deck with a glass of wine and watched the sunset, taking time to appreciate the simple fact that this view, this peace, this freedom was entirely hers. No one could take it away from her. No one could vote her out of her own life. No one could decide she was disposable. The cottage was quiet except for the ocean's rhythm and the distant call of seabirds settling in for the night. Tomorrow, she would tend to her garden, maybe drive into town for lunch at the little bistro where the owner always saved her the table by the window. Simple pleasures that belonged entirely to her. Michael's debt would be paid eventually, whether he managed it responsibly or the business had to garnish his wages. The legal settlement ensured that justice would be served regardless of his choices. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was the knowledge that she'd found the strength to demand the respect she deserved. As the last light faded from the sky, Eleanor raised her glass in a silent toast to William, wherever he was. He'd loved her enough to ensure she'd never be helpless, never dependent on the mercy of people who saw her as expendable, and he'd loved her enough to make sure that when the test came, she'd have everything she needed to pass it. The ocean continued its eternal conversation with the shore, and Eleanor sat in her own home, on her own deck, living her own life, finally understanding what freedom really meant. It meant never again having to beg for a place at a table that should have been hers by right. It meant peace. Now, I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Hidden Hearth for more stories that will surprise you. Thank you for watching until the end.